August 10, 1945, dawned with an oppressive heat over Manila, Philippines. The Pacific War, a brutal conflict that had ravaged countless islands and shattered lives for over 3 years, was nearing its end, though no one dared to speak openly of peace. The air was thick with tension and exhaustion, the scars of battle visible in every ruined building and every weary face. On the outskirts of the city, near the battered remains of Bibid prison, a convoy of military trucks came to a halt. Inside were prisoners unlike any the American soldiers had encountered before, Japanese women captured in the final collapse of the empire's hold on the Philippines. These women were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were nurses, conscripted to care for the wounded under impossible conditions. Others were clerical workers, tasked with destroying sensitive documents as garrisons fell. Some were the wives of officers, swept up in the chaos of surrender and retreat. Their appearance was shocking. Barefoot, their uniforms torn and filthy, their bodies ravaged by disease and starvation. Their hair was matted with lice, their skin marked by sores and exhaustion. They moved slowly, eyes hollow and resigned, as if the war had already claimed their spirits. The American guards, hardened by years of combat in the Pacific, were taken aback by the sight. These women were not the fierce, fanatical enemies they had been trained to expect. Instead, they were broken, vulnerable, and utterly human. The order came through a translator in clipped English: "Remove your clothing for inspection." The women froze, terror gripping them. They had been indoctrinated to believe that surrender meant humiliation, abuse, and worse at the hands of the Americans. They braced for the worst. But what followed was something no one could have anticipated. Instead of cruelty, the women were met with kindness. Crates were opened, revealing fresh cotton dresses, clean shoes, soap, and towels. The prisoners stared in disbelief. The enemy they had been taught to fear and hate was offering them dignity and care. This simple act of compassion shattered years of propaganda and fear, replacing it with confusion, then shame, and finally a reluctant respect. The mountains of northern Luzon, where these women had been captured, were a graveyard for a dying empire. The once mighty Japanese army, which had marched confidently across Asia just 4 years earlier, was now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. Starved, cut off from command, and surrounded by advancing American and Filipino forces, the soldiers and civilians alike moved like ghosts through the dense jungle. Among them were these women, faces few Americans had expected to see in the wreckage of war. By August's second week, with Japan's surrender looming but not yet announced, the women were mere shadows of their former selves. Their bodies were ravaged by dysentery and malaria, their uniforms reduced to rags hanging from emaciated frames. They moved with hollow eyes, resigned to whatever fate awaited them, abandoned by officers who saw them as burdens. Starvation had done what bullets had not. When the American patrol finally cornered them near a ravine, both sides hesitated. The soldiers, battle-hardened by campaigns in New Guinea, Leyte, and Manila, expected treachery. Rumors of Japanese soldiers disguising themselves as civilians or feigning weakness to launch surprise attacks had hardened their resolve. Fingers hovered on triggers. But the women raised trembling hands, some falling to their knees, and the rusted weapons they carried, pistols, bayonets tied to sticks, grenades without pins, were dropped without resistance. The women had been prepared by years of propaganda to expect horror. They had been told Americans were brutal rapists and killers who delighted in tormenting their enemies. Their officers had drilled into them that death was preferable to capture. Yet here, before their rifles, stood not monsters but broken women, too weak to fight or flee. The first command was not one of cruelty. A sergeant barked an order and canteens were unstrapped from belts. Water was passed down the line, one prisoner after another, hands shaking as they drank. Some gulped desperately, others hesitated, fearing poison. A medic stepped forward, arms loaded with bandages and sulfur powder, crouching to tend to a woman whose legs were covered in festering sores. He worked with calm efficiency, treating her as if she were one of his own wounded. A private broke a cigarette in half and offered it to a prisoner. She stared blankly, unable to believe such kindness was possible. When she finally accepted, she cradled the cigarette like a precious relic from another life. Around them, American soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what line they had crossed. They had spent years fighting an enemy who would never surrender. Now they stood over women whose very existence contradicted everything they had been told. For the prisoners, the confusion was even greater. This was not the brutality they had been warned of. There were no jeers, no mocking laughter, no blows. The Americans seemed cautious, unsure how to handle women in a war where women had been invisible. In that hesitation lay the first seed of transformation. One Japanese nurse, whose diary was later discovered, wrote a line that captured the moment. "The enemy gave us water before they asked our names. I do not understand this world anymore." The capture at Luzon was small in the grand scale of the Pacific War, but for these women, it marked the collapse of an entire ideology. The empire had abandoned them to starve in the mountains. The Americans, whom they had been taught to fear as devils, had shown mercy. The exchange of water and food was more than survival. It was the first crack in the wall of lies that had imprisoned their minds as surely as barbed wire confined their bodies. What began in that ravine was not just the capture of prisoners, but the capture of hearts by the simplest of human gestures. The convoy rolled through the shattered streets of Manila, the dust rising beneath the bare feet of the Japanese women as they were transported to a fenced compound that had once been a schoolyard. The war had transformed it into a military installation, a place of confinement and uncertainty. The women, huddled together, stepped down slowly from the trucks, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They had surrendered expecting death or worse, but instead found themselves lined up by American guards who, though armed and stern, did not shout insults or strike them. Clutching their filthy uniforms, stiff with sweat, blood, and months of neglect, the women awaited their fate. The order came again in clipped English translated sharply into Japanese. They were to remove their clothing for inspection. A heavy silence fell over the group. For many, this was the final confirmation of their worst fears. Years of propaganda had taught them that Americans were animals who would strip them, mock them, and then assault them. The trembling began before a single button was undone. Some clung desperately to their rags, others, too weak to resist, began disrobing with tears streaming down their cheeks. The Philippine sun beat down mercilessly, exposing every rib, every wound, every scar, a testament to months of suffering and starvation. But then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of jeers or laughter, crates were opened. Wooden boxes stamped with the insignia of the United States Army were pried open by American hands. Out came bars of soap, thick and white with a faint scent of lavender. Towels, rough but clean, were unfolded and stacked. Buckets of clear water, precious beyond measure after months of drinking from muddy streams, were placed within reach. Brown packages tied neatly with twine were distributed. Inside were cotton dresses, sturdy undergarments, and even shoes in varying sizes. The guards did not leer or laugh. Instead, American nurses, summoned for the occasion, stepped forward. Young women in crisp khaki uniforms, their hair tucked neatly under caps, they spoke softly through interpreters, guiding the prisoners toward makeshift showers fashioned from pipes and barrels. Water pumped by hand cascaded down in steady streams. The Japanese women stood frozen at first, unable to comprehend the scene. Slowly, hesitantly, they began to scrub. Dirt, lice, grease, blood, and filth that had clung like a second skin dissolved under the water. Tears mingled with the flow, not from humiliation but from relief. The cotton dresses, when pulled over clean skin, felt like garments from another life, another world. Plain, simple, and practical, yet to women who had lived in tatters, they were as precious as silk. Some clutched the fabric to their faces, inhaling the lingering scent of soap. The Americans observed carefully, recording details in official reports. Their language was clinical, noting improved hygiene, distribution of standard-issue garments, and prisoners emotionally responsive to treatment. But what those documents could not capture was the shattering of indoctrination in that courtyard. Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as sadists who took pleasure in debasing women. Yet the stripping down was not meant to degrade, it was meant to cleanse, to renew. That evening, as the prisoners sat in their barracks, now clothed and fed, whispers spread among them. One nurse confessed she had expected to be thrown into pits. Another said she had prayed for death before the order to undress came, convinced the Americans would violate them. Instead, she now sat in a clean dress with soap still lingering on her skin. A clerk, once a devout believer in the Empire's words, murmured to the others that everything they had been told must have been lies. That day in Manila became the moment the first illusions collapsed. For women who had expected only dishonor and brutality, the Americans had given something they had not known in years: dignity. The act was simple, almost bureaucratic in nature, yet it carried the weight of a revelation. Stripped not of their humanity but of their illusions, the Japanese women began to see their captors with new eyes. What they had believed to be monsters had shown them mercy, and in that mercy lay the beginning of their transformation. The clang of the mess hall bell startled the women who had been sitting in silence, their hands folded tightly in their laps. They were marched into a long wooden building with wide windows and the smell of smoke drifting from stoves at the far end. Rows of tables stretched the length of the room, and American soldiers acting as stewards moved briskly behind counters where steaming pots waited. The Japanese women lined up hesitantly, their bare feet patting softly on worn floorboards. In their minds, mealtime in captivity could mean anything: watery gruel, scraps tossed on the ground, or nothing at all. Instead, what was placed before them seemed like a dream. On their trays lay thick slices of white bread, soft and warm to the touch. Ladles of meat stew, fragrant with onions and potatoes, followed. Cubes of beef swam in rich brown broth. A scoop of green beans, bright with butter and salt, came next. At the end of the line, a soldier poured black coffee into tin cups, the aroma filling the hall with an unfamiliar richness. The women stared at their trays as though hallucinating. For months they had survived on handfuls of rice, sometimes mixed with weeds, sometimes with nothing at all. They had learned to chew slowly, savor every grain, because each one was precious. Many had gnawed on bark or roots in the mountains, believing starvation preferable to surrender. Now here was abundance, food given without conditions, served in orderly portions. It contradicted everything they had been told. Propaganda had drilled into them that America was starving, strangled by blockade, desperate for resources. Yet here was proof of the opposite, laid out in meat and bread. Some women froze, refusing to lift their spoons, convinced this was a cruel trick meant to test their dignity. Others nibbled cautiously as though the food might contain poison. But nothing happened. The Americans at the end of the tables did not laugh or jeer. They simply gestured for the women to sit and eat. One guard, noticing a prisoner still staring at her tray, mimed taking a big bite and gave a small nod of encouragement. Slowly, almost fearfully, the first spoons rose to mouths. The taste was overwhelming. The stew was rich, almost unbearably so after months of thin rice. The bread, fluffy and soft, felt decadent in their mouths. The coffee, bitter but strong, was swallowed with wide-eyed wonder. Soon hesitation gave way to hunger. The sound of spoons scraping bowls filled the hall. A few prisoners tried to eat slowly, but most devoured their food with an intensity that spoke of months of deprivation. When trays were cleaned, American soldiers walked down the rows with ladles, offering second helpings. The women looked at one another in disbelief. Second helpings? In Japan, even generals had been rationed less than this. Here, in captivity, they were being fed more than they had eaten in years. One nurse later scribbled a note on a scrap of paper, hiding it in her belongings: "The enemy eats better than our generals. They give us food as if we were their own people. How can this be true? Everything we were told is lies." Another whispered to her companion that perhaps America had not been weakened at all, that maybe their empire had misled them from the start. An American nurse added a final blow to the moment when she appeared at the end of the hall with a small bowl of sugar. Through the interpreter, she explained that some liked their coffee sweet. She stirred carefully, then handed the cup to a prisoner with a gentle smile, as though serving a guest. The prisoner bowed her head, tears running silently down her cheeks as she took the cup in both hands. That night in the barracks, the women spoke in hushed tones, their stomachs full for the first time in months, growling not with hunger but with disbelief. Could the empire have lied so completely? Could the nation they were told was collapsing under war truly have such abundance? Each spoonful of stew, each slice of bread demolished another brick in the wall of illusions built around them. It was not just food. It was a revelation. And in that revelation, the women began to whisper among themselves for the first time that perhaps everything they had been told about the war, about their enemies, about America itself, might be false. The morning after their first full meal, the Japanese women were led in small groups across the compound, their bare feet shuffling against gravel, the newly issued cotton dresses hanging loosely on their thin frames. At the end of a long corridor, a former classroom had been transformed into an improvised clinic. Tables were pushed against the walls, shelves lined with bottles and jars, and the sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air. The women hesitated at the doorway, clutching one another, uncertain if this was the moment when kindness would turn to cruelty. Inside, American medics in white coats and khaki uniforms waited with clipboards. The guards gestured for the women to sit, and slowly, reluctantly, they complied. For many, this was the first time since their capture that fear returned in full force. In their minds, medical inspection meant experimentation, humiliation, perhaps even mutilation. They had heard whispered rumors of how Japan itself had treated prisoners. Men used for bayonet practice, women abandoned or worse. But what happened next defied every expectation. The first woman, her legs covered in weeping sores, was gently lifted onto a cot. An American medic crouched beside her, speaking softly through an interpreter. He cleaned the wounds with warm water, applied sulfur powder, and bandaged them carefully. She flinched at first, waiting for the pain of a blow, but none came. Another prisoner with swollen gums and loose teeth from scurvy was handed tablets rich in vitamins. Yet another, her skin crawling with lice, was given a full bath in medicated soap, her hair washed and combed by an American nurse as though she were her own patient. For one woman, the attention was nothing short of miraculous. She had been struggling for weeks with violent coughing fits, her lungs burning with each breath. In Japan, pneumonia was often a death sentence. Here, she was carried to a field hospital and placed beneath a transparent mask that hissed with flowing oxygen. The cool air filled her chest, easing what had felt like the slow grip of death. She stared at the unfamiliar equipment, the rubber tubes, the steady flow of gas, as if glimpsing sorcery. Another prisoner, feverish and shivering, was diagnosed with malaria. Japanese stocks of quinine had long run out, forcing her to endure attacks that racked her body with agony. An American doctor ordered quinine tablets from the dispensary, and within days the fever broke. The woman wept openly when she realized the Americans had given her what her own nation could not. What stunned the women most was not simply the medicines, but the demeanor of those who administered them. They were enemies, yet they were spoken to with patience and even respect. A nurse would hold a woman's hand during an injection, whispering reassurance through a translator. A doctor would check a bandage twice to ensure it was not too tight. The professionalism was no different than what they might have shown their own soldiers. For women raised in a culture where surrender was shame, where captured enemies were despised or killed outright, this was incomprehensible. They had prepared for cruelty and instead found compassion. Some cried openly on the cots, covering their faces with trembling hands, convinced such kindness must hide some darker trick. Yet day after day the care continued. The wounds healed, the fevers lifted, the coughs quieted. Slowly the fear began to erode. Historians who studied their diaries decades later pointed to this moment as a turning point. The discovery of compassion in medicine did more to demolish propaganda than 1,000 speeches ever could. The Japanese women, who had once whispered of Americans as barbarians, now whispered in awe of their doctors and nurses. They began to see their captors not as monsters, but as men and women who embodied something entirely foreign to their own experience. A system that valued human life, even that of the enemy. It was in those small acts, an oxygen mask lowered over trembling lips, a spoonful of medicine offered with a smile, a wound dressed with careful hands, that the foundations of belief cracked. The empire had abandoned them to die. The enemy had chosen to heal them. And in that healing, a new and disorienting truth took root. Perhaps everything they had believed about this war and about the people they fought had been a lie. By the final weeks of August, the Japanese women had been moved from the isolation of initial processing into barracks housing prisoners of many nations. The long wooden buildings, though simple, were solid, fitted with windows, electric lights, and cots lined in rows. To women who had spent months sleeping on damp jungle ground or crumbling bamboo mats, the sight of a mattress and a blanket felt like indulgence. But more astonishing than the barracks themselves was the routine of daily life that unfolded around them, a rhythm that revealed an America they had never been permitted to imagine. The Americans, pressed by labor shortages as their armies advanced across the Pacific, began assigning prisoners to simple duties. The Japanese women were not sent to heavy labor, but to tasks that seemed menial, sewing repairs for uniforms, scrubbing kitchens, preparing vegetables for stews, keeping the barracks clean. At first, the women approached their work with suspicion, waiting for the inevitable cruelty that must follow. But there was none. They were given instructions, sometimes through interpreters, sometimes through gestures, and their efforts were accepted without ridicule. For their labor they were rewarded not with blows, but with cigarettes, soap, or sometimes an extra portion of bread. Yet it was not the work itself that unsettled them most, but what they witnessed in the process. They saw African American soldiers in uniform working side by side with white Americans, not segregated in shameful corners as Japanese propaganda had long depicted, but sharing the same tables, eating from the same kitchens. They saw women in khaki uniforms giving orders to men, sergeants and corporals who obeyed without hesitation or scorn. This was an inversion of everything they had been told. In Japan, women were confined to silence and service, their voices irrelevant in the machinery of war. Here, women carried authority openly and men accepted it as natural. The prisoners were further bewildered when they realized their own conditions were not those of silence and suppression. They were allowed to receive newspapers, to read them without censorship. Some were even permitted to write letters, carefully inspected but still delivered. Cigarettes were distributed freely, not as bribes but as rations. The Japanese women watched other prisoners laugh, converse, even debate politics with their captors. To them, the concept of a prisoner expressing opinion to a guard without punishment was unimaginable. One Japanese clerk who had spent the war copying military orders under constant fear of reprisal later wrote in her diary, "We were told Americans were weak because they allowed women to command and because they mixed races, yet their system worked better than ours. The soldiers obeyed willingly. The camp was orderly. We had been told lies." Every passing day in the camp dismantled more of the illusions hammered into them by the empire. They saw warehouses overflowing with supplies. Rows of crates marked with American eagles filled with food, medicine, and clothing. Trucks rolled in and out of the compound, heavy with goods that seemed to have no end. The kitchens never ran short of bread or meat. The barracks glowed each night with electric light, steady and bright. While in Japan, entire cities stumbled in darkness from bombing and shortages, the women began whispering among themselves as they folded uniforms or scrubbed pots. America was not a starving, decadent nation. It was a giant whose strength lay not only in its machines and endless resources, but in its astonishing humanity. Their captors did not need to shout to command obedience, nor did they need to instill fear to maintain order. Discipline came from a system built on respect, on abundance, on confidence so deep it could afford kindness to its enemies. Each day of work was not just a duty but a revelation. Each sight a contradiction to the world they had known. And as they bore witness to these contradictions, the wall of imperial certainty cracked further, letting in the light of an entirely different vision of power. As the weeks of captivity slowly folded into months, the initial terror that had gripped the Japanese women began to give way to a strange, uneasy rhythm of life behind barbed wire. The days were marked by routine, meals, work, medical inspections, but it was the quiet moments, the small intrusions of unexpected kindness, that unsettled them most deeply. It began with the letters. One afternoon, an American officer walked through the compound carrying a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He called out names from a list, his voice loud enough to carry across the courtyard. The women sat frozen, unable to believe what they were hearing. When he handed out folded envelopes marked with the insignia of the Red Cross, the prisoners took them with trembling hands. These were letters from home, written months earlier in cramped Japanese script, somehow carried across oceans of war to arrive intact in an enemy's camp. The shock was not just that the letters existed, but that they had not been shredded, censored beyond recognition, or withheld entirely. The American officials had opened them only enough to remove sensitive details, military locations, troop movements, yet left intact the words of husbands, fathers, and children. One woman clutched a letter from her mother, the ink smudged with tears, and read it aloud in the dim light of the barracks. Another discovered drawings from her son, stick figures of airplanes and mountains, preserved carefully within the envelope. They had been told the Americans would never honor such messages, that enemies would mock or discard them. Yet here they were, whole, delivered by the very men they had once sworn to kill. Then came Christmas. December in Manila was still hot, the air heavy with humidity, but the Americans spoke of snow and winter trees. The women thought little of it until boxes began arriving at the compound, shipped by church groups and civic organizations across the United States. Inside were small treasures beyond anything they could have imagined. Cigarettes wrapped neatly in paper, bars of soap scented faintly with lavender, tins of candy, and most baffling of all, handwritten notes. These notes were from American children, written in clumsy but earnest handwriting, wishing their enemy friends well. Some said simply, "Merry Christmas. We hope you're safe." Others included drawings of snowmen, trees draped in tinsel, stars shining above peaceful homes. The Japanese women stared at the cards, unable to make sense of them. These were the sons and daughters of men who were still fighting, still dying on distant islands. Yet they had written to prisoners as if they were neighbors, not enemies. The packages were not propaganda leaflets scattered from the sky. They were genuine gifts collected and sent by families who had chosen compassion when vengeance would have been easy. On Christmas Eve, the compound gathered for a service arranged by local volunteers. A small group of Filipino and American singers entered the yard, their voices rising in carols. To the astonishment of the prisoners, several verses were sung in Japanese, carefully practiced for the occasion. The words of "Silent Night" and "O Come All Ye Faithful" carried across the wire in their own tongue, filling the humid night with music that pierced straight through the armor of indoctrination. Women who had held themselves rigid for months finally broke. They wept openly, some burying their faces in their hands, others sobbing against the shoulders of companions. For many, it was the first time they had cried without fear of punishment. They cried not from hunger nor from pain, but from the collapse of certainty. If these enemies could send packages, if their children could write letters of kindness, if they could sing carols in Japanese simply to comfort strangers, then perhaps everything the empire had told them about America was a lie. This was not mere charity. It was something far more devastating to the illusions of Imperial Japan. The gifts, the letters, the music were demonstrations of a strength so unshakable it had no need for cruelty. The Americans could afford to treat their enemies with dignity because they had no fear of them. Mercy was not weakness. It was the mark of overwhelming power. In those weeks of winter, behind barbed wire in a ruined city, the Japanese women learned a truth their leaders had denied them. America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its ships, but its capacity to give, even to those who had come to destroy it. The news arrived not with the thunder of guns, but with the rustle of paper. On a warm morning in early September 1945, American guards entered the camp with armfuls of newspapers. They did not hide them nor censor the pages. Instead, they handed them directly to the prisoners, who opened them with trembling hands. Across the front page, in bold headlines that even those who could not read English understood, was the announcement, "Japan has surrendered. The war is over." The empire for which they had endured hunger, disease, and humiliation was finished. The women gathered in small clusters around those who could translate. The words spilled out like blows. The atomic bomb had obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tokyo lay in ruins. Entire cities were flattened. Their leaders, the men they had been told embodied honor and divine destiny, had capitulated. For some, the news brought silence, their eyes vacant, as though their souls had already departed. Others wept openly, clutching at the dresses the Americans had given them, unable to reconcile the image of a once mighty nation now reduced to ash. But there were others for whom the surrender was less a catastrophe than a confirmation. They had already felt the foundations of belief cracking during their months of captivity. They had been fed while their comrades starved, clothed while their nation could not provide even rags, healed with medicines their own doctors had lacked. They had seen compassion from those they had been taught to call barbarians. For these women, the newspaper was not only an obituary for the empire but also a revelation of truth that had been plain before their eyes for weeks. One nurse writing in the margin of her Red Cross letter captured the moment with painful clarity. "We fought for men who let us starve. Our enemies gave us food. We followed leaders who told us lies. Our captors showed us truth. The empire is ash. Perhaps America will show us how to live again." In the days that followed, the Americans began preparing the prisoners for repatriation. Yet the preparations went beyond logistics. Classes were organized in hygiene, literacy, and basic health. Lectures were given on democratic principles, civic responsibility, and how Japan would not be destroyed but rebuilt, for women who had expected enslavement or execution. These sessions were bewildering. Why would victors rebuild what they had just crushed? Why offer hope when vengeance was expected? The answer was repeated again and again, patiently and firmly, because peace is stronger than conquest. To women who had known only brutality in war, who had lived under a system that exalted death over surrender, this concept was staggering. They sat in silence, objecting to the idea that strength could be measured not by domination, but by cooperation. Some prisoners struggled with guilt. They thought of families left behind in Japan still enduring hunger and bombing, while they themselves had eaten meat and bread under American guard. They wrestled with shame at having believed so completely in the empire's lies. Yet others found themselves daring to imagine a different Japan, one not defined by conquest and sacrifice, but by rebuilding and renewal. Each lesson, each conversation, and each American gesture of dignity added to the transformation already underway. The newspapers that had announced defeat did not crush them. Instead, they exposed a possibility their leaders had never allowed them to consider. A Japan reborn not through blood, but through peace. The barbed wire around the camp had once symbolized captivity. Now, to many of the women, it symbolized an unexpected liberation, from hunger, from fear, and most of all, from illusion. The empire that had demanded everything had given them nothing. The enemy they had feared had given them back their humanity. And in that realization, belief itself shattered, leaving behind something raw but alive. A hope that perhaps, after all the ruins, life could begin again. In the early months of 1946, the war-weary Japanese women prepared to leave the camp and return home. The journey across the Pacific was quiet and somber, filled with uncertainty and eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as if afraid of what awaited them. The transport ships carried them back to a homeland that no longer resembled the country they had left behind. When the ships finally docked at Yokohama, the women stepped down onto broken piers, greeted by a landscape scarred by war. The skyline was a jagged silhouette of ruins, the air heavy with the smell of ash and despair. Japan was no longer a proud empire, it was rubble, hunger, and silence. Yet even in this desolation the women carried something invisible with them, something their nation could not confiscate: memory. They remembered the clean cotton dresses handed to them in Manila, the soap and water that had washed away months of filth. They remembered the hot meals that filled their bellies, the bowls of stew and soft white bread that seemed like fantasy after years of scarcity. They remembered American doctors who had placed oxygen masks over their faces, nurses who had spoken gently while changing bandages, guards who had encouraged them to eat, and officers who had delivered their letters intact. They remembered the Christmas packages filled with candy and notes written by American children who had called them enemy friends. These memories spread quickly through villages and cities where hunger gnawed at families and faith in authority had collapsed. Mothers whispered to daughters that the Americans had treated even captured women with dignity. Fathers listened in stunned silence as they heard their wives' stories repeated by neighbors. That prisoners of war had eaten better than generals. That the Americans had allowed enemies to write letters home. The compassion had come not from their own leaders, but from the very people they had been taught to despise. The testimonies of these women merged with those of returning soldiers and male prisoners. Together they formed a collective realization: the empire had lied. The state that had demanded total loyalty had abandoned its people to starve. The enemy that had been painted as barbaric had shown truth, order, abundance, and above all, humanity. This was not rumor or propaganda. It was lived experience carried back in the voices and memories of those who had endured captivity. In the years that followed, many of these women became teachers, nurses, and advocates. Their influence shaped a generation of children who would grow up in a democratic Japan. They spoke quietly but firmly about what they had seen: a system where women could command men, where races worked side by side, where mercy was shown even to enemies. Their stories lent credibility to the reforms that swept through Japan under American occupation, reinforcing the idea that democracy was not weakness but strength. Decades later, some of the women returned to the United States, not as prisoners but as visitors. They walked through the same streets they had glimpsed from guarded trucks, this time as free guests. Some sought out the families who had sent Christmas packages or written letters of kindness. Others stood in front of universities, hospitals, and churches, recognizing in peace what they had first glimpsed in captivity. A few wrote memoirs, their words echoing through history as reminders that even in war, the smallest acts of dignity can dismantle the mightiest illusions. The lesson they carried and passed on was simple yet devastating in its clarity. America's most powerful weapon had not been its bombs or its guns. It had not been fleets of ships or armies of soldiers. The most devastating blow to Japanese propaganda had come in the form of humanity. A warm meal, a clean dress, a doctor's touch, a child's handwritten note. These were the things that shattered lies more completely than firebombs could shatter cities. The women who returned in 1946 did so to a country broken, but they carried within them seeds of renewal. Their testimony became part of the foundation on which post-war Japan was rebuilt. They had gone into captivity believing they would be dishonored, destroyed, forgotten. They emerged carrying proof that mercy itself can be revolutionary. And as their voices joined those of others who had seen America with their own eyes, a new story took root, one that would guide Japan not toward domination, but toward cooperation, peace, and the unthinkable idea that former enemies could become partners. The years following the war were a time of profound transformation, not only for Japan but for the world. The women who had endured captivity carried with them stories that challenged the very foundations of their former beliefs. Their experiences became a quiet but powerful force in shaping the future of a nation struggling to rise from the ashes. Back in Japan, these women found themselves at the crossroads of history. The empire that had demanded absolute loyalty and sacrifice was gone, replaced by an uncertain peace. Many faced suspicion and scorn from those who still clung to the old ways, but others saw in their testimonies a path forward. They spoke of a world where compassion could exist even between enemies, where strength was measured not by conquest but by the ability to rebuild and forgive. Their voices, once silenced by war and propaganda, now carried the weight of lived truth. In classrooms and community centers they shared lessons learned behind barbed wire, lessons of dignity, respect, and the power of mercy. They taught children about the humanity they had witnessed, about the soldiers and nurses who had cared for them despite the horrors of war. Their stories helped to nurture a new generation that would grow up embracing democracy, equality, and peace. They became advocates for women's rights, education, and healthcare, embodying the very principles that had sustained them in captivity. Some returned to the United States years later, not as prisoners but as ambassadors of reconciliation. They visited the families who had sent Christmas packages, the schools where American nurses had trained, and the hospitals where they had received care. These visits were moments of healing, bridging the gap between former enemies and forging bonds of friendship. Their memoirs and testimonies entered the historical record, reminding the world that even in the darkest times humanity can prevail. They stood as living proof that war's greatest weapon is not destruction, but the capacity to show kindness to those who once were foes. The legacy of these women is a testament to the enduring power of compassion. Their journey from fear and despair to hope and renewal illustrates how mercy can dismantle the mightiest illusions and lay the groundwork for peace. In the end, the story of these Japanese women prisoners of war is not just about captivity or survival. It is about the transformative power of empathy and the possibility of a future where former enemies become partners in building a better world. Their experience teaches us that true strength lies not in domination or vengeance, but in the courage to extend humanity to all, even those we once called enemies. As history moves forward, their voices continue to echo, urging us to remember that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of understanding, respect, and shared dignity. And in that understanding, the seeds of a new beginning are sown, one where the lessons of the past guide us toward a future defined by cooperation, compassion, and hope.